Well, good morning. It feels about like those inset days when you're a middle leader and you're following your head who's done the introduction to the day. So it's not very often I get to come and share a platform just after my boss. So that was a really interesting opportunity to hear her respond to some of your questions. So a couple of things I want to say about it. When I was sitting down at the front here, this slogan here, the future of our region is in school. You could actually just substitute that with the future of our country with that. And what I want to talk about this morning, I think, is about the role that I have as National Schools Commissioner, the relationship that I have with the Regional Schools Commissioners, and of course Jan Renew, who is the RSC for this area. But to talk, I suppose, in a little bit more detail about how are we going to do some of the things that you've heard this morning. How are we going to have the kind of impact upon improving the quality of education through school improvement that we need to do. I came to this very room, I think, or a room very similar to it, back in June when I started doing my roadshows and talked to around about 70 or 80 people at that point about what I'd worked out was the strategy for trying to lead the system from my background over the course of the summer. And I'm a bit clearer about it today. So I want to share some of the thinking around that if I can. I'm hoping if I press the button here, I get to see a slide. Mr. Cameraman, would you move to your right or your left? That'd be really helpful. Thank you very much. So, that's interesting. Oh yes, it is the right presentation. Okay. God knows what was on my laptop last night. This morning, what I thought I'd take as my theme, come on, focus, was on why leadership matters. Because I think one of the things that I've seen in the 6 months that I've been in this role is the power of leadership to make a huge difference. And I don't mean leadership in terms of your title. I don't mean leadership in terms of the fact you have an office. I mean the culture of leadership and the way that we build that culture of leadership in our schools, in our trusts, in our regions, and across the country. So my thinking around this morning is informed a bit by two things. First of all, what you see behind me is what I used to call in the Cabot Learning Federation, where I was the CEO, the learning triangle. And the learning triangle has three elements to it. It's got the staff relationship, it's got the parental relationship, and it's got the community relationship. And if those three parts of the triangle are intact, then hopefully the impact is on the centre with the children. And whether you're doing the role that I'm doing, or roles I've done in the past, or the ones that you're doing, I think that model of thinking around how as leaders do we preserve the integrity of the triangle is a really important part of how we underpin leadership. And around the outside, I've put 4 building blocks. The first one I've talked about where the leader influences. And that's a really important part of the role that we do in terms of influencing other people. How do we role model what great leadership looks like? How do we live and breathe what we say our values are? In the bottom left-hand corner, I've talked about the word engagement. And what I mean by this is there'll be people of you in this room, and I would count myself as one of them, who's worked for heads in the past who were really great trailblazers. And they were recognised for being trailblazers, but they made mistakes. And one of the mistakes that they often make was they didn't look over their shoulder to make sure that people were coming with them. So for me, when I talk about engagement on that slide, what I mean is this notion about how you create fellowship and how do you take people with you. In the top right-hand corner, I talk about building confidence. And one of our challenges, whether it's part of the social mobility debate we're about to have, or just in terms of how we lead our communities, is how do we give, through our leadership, communities confidence in education as it's seen as part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And if we get those 3 building blocks around the triangle right, then I think we deliver the impact that we talk about. And so one of the things I want to do in this role, as my role emerges and deepens in terms of its impact, is to talk the language of leadership and try to see the challenge in the system through the lens of headship, which is what I've spent the bulk of my career doing. I've been I was a head for 20 years. I was CEO before I came in to the regional and now the National Schools Commissioner role just over 2 years ago. If there was one bit of thinking or one book I'd recommend to you that I read over the summer, it's this one by Matthew Said on black box thinking. And what he talks about in that is the theory of marginal gains. And I don't think it's ever applied more logically as a theoretical concept to our challenge at the moment. He talks about learning more from failure, because that's a really important part of it. And in an accountability system, we have to make sure that we learn in order to progress. He talks about if you're trying to make 10% improvement, trying to improve one thing by 10% is really difficult. But improving 10 things by 1% is doable. And one of our challenges as leaders is to have that forensic eye upon the things that we know we want to make better and work out how we're going to deliver that. And the final point he makes is that we have to build in this tolerance of risk into our thinking. Now, there is a slight tension there in terms of the answer to the question that you heard this morning about where are we around primary assessment, because that's exactly where we are right now. But I hope you also heard a Secretary of State talk about listening and that we haven't reached the end point of that yet, because I think that's quite a significant comment that you heard. So if we're serious about leadership being heart of a school-led system, I think it goes through a new series of cycles. And I think that first cycle is about being a great leader in your classroom. The example I'm going to give you around this goes back just over a year when I was the South West Regional Schools Commissioner, and I went to visit an academy in Swindon who had made the biggest increase in their performance from the previous year. It was 5A SEM figure at the time, and in 2015 their results were, sorry, 2014 their results were 32%, and the following year they got it up to 63. So they were the most improved school on that measure in the Southwest. And I went to visit it, and I went on the very first day of term to go to the staff briefing in the morning and congratulate the staff and talk about what a great achievement they'd been part of. And then the head said, what I want to do, let's go for a quick learning walk before you have to go. So I went. Bell went, lesson 1 of the academic year. First lesson. The head and the Regional Schools Commissioner were walking around the corridors. That was really popular. But we went to the first classroom, and outside the classroom was a young teacher talking to a set 3 of 4 English Year 9 class. And what she talked about outside the classroom was what they were going to learn that day, what her expectations were for the lesson that was about to happen, what her expectations were for the rest of the week and the rest of the term. There was a seating plan, and this is why we've got one, and this is what we will do together. So whilst that was no doubt a product of her training, because she was a newly qualified teacher, it wasn't just day 1 of the year, it was day 1 of her career with these 2 people standing outside her classroom. But what I saw there was somebody thinking as a leader. She may not have quantified in that way, but she was using some leadership language to talk about what was going to happen in her classroom. And so for me, great leadership starts in the classroom. Great leadership starts with all of those colleagues who are not teachers but work with children. People who come under the global banner of support staff or the global banner of administrative staff. People who make a difference to the lives of children. Leadership cuts right the way through all of that. The next level on that rung, for me, is about, getting the slides right, is about the great middle leader. And how we take that step from the classroom to now having an influence, not just in your classroom, but in the 3 or 4 classrooms that may be surrounding where your practice is. And how do you take the skills that you've developed as a teacher and the quality that you deliver to enable people alongside you as part of your team to become consistently good teachers? And what I see the best middle leaders doing is that day in, day out. But they're also able to take what the school says its vision is and translate it into something meaningful that on that corridor or that group of classrooms, that team understands the contribution that they're going to make. When we talk about great school leadership, you'll notice I haven't talked about headship necessarily here, because there are so many different ways that people now move beyond middle leadership to have an impact upon the school. I don't think it's as simple as just saying headship, because I think there are vice assistant principal jobs, there are deputy headships, there are headships, there are executive headships, there are CEOs, there are regional this, regional that. It's a different concept, I think, about how that's working. And if I think about the one thing on my slide here that characterizes what leadership at this level I think has an impact around, it's the second one down, which is the ability to take the vision, to turn it into a plan, and then to deliver that plan. And then recognize that once you've done that once, you still have to go back and do it again, because the things that you thought were going to stick as part of that development haven't yet done so. So that cyclical approach to thinking about change and innovation and improvement is what I think the great school leaders do. And they have all the other things, of course, that make up that role a success. And what's relatively new in our system is about this concept of the executive leader. And I had my first experience in this role from 2007 to 2009. And the journey that I went on was from being the head of a single secondary school in Bristol to being the executive head of 3. And the mistake that I made in the first year, 2007-2008, was to assume that I could simply translate what I'd done as the head of 1 school into being the head of 3 schools. And of course I failed, because although the scope got bigger, although the remit got bigger, although I had a bigger leadership team, I still only had 24 hours in the day. And the reality is that working across schools as we do, as many people do, as many of you in the room do today, is a different skill set. It's very, very clear that people who are great leaders of individual schools can translate that leadership up to the next stage of working across more than one school. But it's not a given that it's the same job, and it's not a given that the same skills will get you through it. And I try to think about, as I inform what we do in the department, about trying to create a leadership strategy for the system, or what some of those indicators. And I think the four I talk about are these. I think executive leaders understand and respect the relationship between autonomy and systems. They understand the principle of what earned autonomy means. Because when we look at some of the trusts that grew very quickly in the last 5 or 6 years,